Hello and welcome to Working Wise, a podcast created and produced by K&L Gates. Each episode is designed to provide labor and employment updates and compliance tips to lawyers and HR professionals. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
Hello and welcome to the first in the new series of safety podcasts, which are being released as part of the K&L Gates Working Wise podcast series. My name's Dom Fleeton. I'm a partner at K&L Gates based in Melbourne, Australia. I'm thrilled to be joined by two of my fellow K&L Gates partners, Dylan Moses and David Lindsay. Dylan's based in our London office and David is based in our Raleigh office. Welcome to you both and thank you for being here. To set the scene, the three of us were together earlier this year and we were talking about a number of issues that were high on the radar in our own geographic areas of practice, both from a legislative and regulatory point of view. And we were effectively comparing notes. And I was very curious about developments in the area of psychosocial health, which is the topic of this podcast, and what was happening in the UK and the United States on that front. And it was a great discussion. And we quickly realised that listening to that sort of compare and contrast discussion might be something that our clients across the K&L Gates platform and anyone else who listens to the Working Wise podcasts might find beneficial. We've seen in recent years that particular areas of regulation or particular issues that give rise to a host of legal questions often start in one part of the world and then begin to spread across the globe.
Dom, Dylan speaking. Just really sort of some high-level points from the UK perspective, which again, we were discussing together earlier this year to sort of set the scene, set some of the discussion topics we're going to go into. I suppose the high-level message for us is that in the UK, health has been on the business plan of the Health and Safety Executive for a number of years to try and do more in relation to health. But as to how that's translated into how that really works in the workplace, it's been a bit of a nebulous concept for quite a long time. Most of the sort of concentration in the UK has been on safety and taking safety away from paper manuals and paper safety and making it more practical safety. But on the health side, less has been done in that space. But in more recent times, there has been a change in relation to that. In some ways, it'd be interesting to sort of hear whether that's been accelerated by COVID and, sort of greater reflection on workers' health as well as safety. But the HSE has certainly, in more recent times, committed to management standards in the UK, in which they've started to manage work-related stress, work-related activities, looking at, reasons why people become low in productivity as to, whether it's the way in which they're working, what controls are in place, looking at ways in which people with responsibilities for caring for workers can make sure that their workers are in tip-top health to do the work. So I suppose the sort of headline music from us in London is that there has been a greater refocusing on health as well as safety in recent times. And it'd be interesting to compare how that, sort of sits alongside the approaches in Australia and the US.
Thanks, Dylan. This is David. Just a quick comment from a U.S. perspective. I think what's interesting about safety topics is how much the various regulatory schemes differ. As we'll discuss further, while many of the same concepts may apply, Australia and the U.K. certainly seem to take a more aggressive approach to enforcement of workplace safety rules than do U.S. regulators, and are well ahead of the U.S. in areas like the ones we're going to discuss here in a little bit, which is psychosocial health.
Thank you, David. Yeah, and I think that touch on all of those various points that you've raised in a bit more detail. And I think what I found interesting there, Dylan, is comments you were making about perhaps not renewed, but new focus on health in the UK and where that's come from. And I'll speak in a minute to the emphasis that's been placed on that here. And when I'm saying health, we're talking more about mental health, psychosocial health, and how that's come about. And we might as well just get into it. So when I say psychosocial, what do I mean? In this context, in an Australian context, it is referring to mental health, but it's slightly broader. It's really referring to a person's mental, emotional, and social well-being as they connect to health and wellness, and is particularly focused on stressors and the need for employees to cope under stress and pressure and issues that make it harder for individuals to cope with that stress and pressure. And in terms of the focus on that side of health, from a statutory point of view, it's not new here in Australia. For years and years, we've had work health and safety legislation in force in all of our states and territories and also at Commonwealth level, which requires employers to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, the health and safety of workers who are at work in their business, and also to ensure that the health and safety of other people, who I just broadly call non-workers, is also not put at risk from the work carried out as part of their business. And health has been defined as both physical and psychological health. But it became evident that the primary focus of employers was on the protection of physical health, and that there was, in effect, a lack of understanding about how to comply with the law in regards to psychosocial hazards. And in 2018, a detailed review was undertaken of our model work health and safety legislation here. It was known as the Boland Review. It was finalised in December 2018. So it was a pre-COVID review, and it found that many businesses were uncertain about how to best address psychological health in the workplace, and that businesses, small businesses and larger businesses, wanted more prescription and practical guidance to help them identify and manage psychosocial risks and hazards. And that a common landing point was that there was a need for more architecture to build on the very broad duties that are contained in the Acts. And by architecture, they're referring to more detailed regulations and also codes of practice. And that is what has followed, albeit some years after that review was handed down. We're at a point now where in Australia, 6 states and territories have already made specific regulations which are intended to be more prescriptive than the primary legislation in an effort to help employers better comply with their obligations in the context of psychosocial hazards. And there are 2 more. The last 2 states and territories have announced in the past week that they are doing the same. So we will have effective, some very minor variations, but effective uniformity in that regard by the end of this year, 2023. I thought it'd be useful just to go over some of the key aspects of this more detailed architecture that's been put in place, and some of it's definitional, which of course is very helpful. So, for example, these new regulations define what is a psychosocial risk. So that's a risk to the health or safety of a worker or other person from a psychosocial hazard, which begs the question, what's a psychosocial hazard? A hazard that arises from or relates to the design or management of work, or a work environment, or workplace interactions, or workplace behaviours that may cause psychological harm. Not might or not likely to, but that may cause psychological harm. And the guidance material that's been produced in the form of codes of practice, which for people who are based outside of Australia are effectively guidance documents issued by regulators. They aren't law. If you breach a code of practice, it isn't a breach of law, but it effectively is explaining to employers the standard that they need to meet. And so they are very important documents that courts have regard to in OHS prosecutions. But there's been a model code of practice produced, and the various states and territories are picking it up and effectively making their own version, but it all looks very similar, and that's well worth reading. But it provides examples of what are referred to as common psychosocial hazards. So there are some ones that I think are particularly obvious, things like bullying and harassment, occupational violence and occupational aggression, but there are also traumatic events as well, I should say. And then there are others which might not have been as obvious, perhaps, even if we look back 5-10 years ago, thinking about what employers were supposed to do to maintain a safe working environment. So things like high job demands, which includes long hours, very intense, prolonged periods of work, very tight deadlines and the like, but also concepts like low job control and other sort of more nebulous concepts like poor organisational justice. An example of that is, not applying a policy or a standard or a code of conduct fairly or evenly across the workforce. The regulations also provide more detailed guidance about what needs to be considered when employers are identifying the steps to eliminate these risks, which in many instances is not possible. For example, you can't really eliminate the risk of bullying in a workplace. It's really about risk minimisation. And when employers are going about that, which should form part of the risk assessment process, you identify the risk, you work out how severe it is, you identify potential controls, and you identify the controls that are reasonably practicable for you to adopt. You need to be taking into account a range of factors, including duration, frequency, and severity of the exposure to the particular psychosocial hazard, and also how that hazard may interact or combine with others. So, for example, if people are working in remote or isolated environments and they're also working under very tight time pressure or working very long hours, those are two, the isolation and the work intensity of the high job demands, separate hazards which can interact and together have a disproportionately negative impact on a person's health. I suppose you could say there's more meat being put on the bones through these regulations. It still is quite a vexed issue because ultimately dealing with a lot of issues which are effectively intangible. While it's very easy to see a piece of equipment that's poorly guarded and you can quickly identify that that's a risk and what the obvious impact on an individual would be if they were to try and access machinery in an unguarded area while it was operating, it's less easy to sometimes draw a line of causation between something that might be in the existence in a workplace and a particular person's mental health and psychosocial well-being. Now, the other thing that's important to note is these legislative changes have been accompanied by what I'd refer to as an upskilling of safety regulators. So, for example, in the state where I live and do a lot of my work, which is Victoria, our safety regulator, WorkSafe Victoria, established a few years ago now a separate team within its inspectorate, and it's known as the Psychosocial Unit, which is comprised of inspectors who clearly, based on my interactions with them and interactions that my colleagues have had with them, have been given a lot of additional training in this space. I suspect a lot of work with consultant psychologists and the like to be able to help them really focus on psychosocial hazards and risks and approaches to mitigating those risks so that they can work constructively in many instances with employers and be able to identify where employers are in breach, if that's the case. But also, importantly, and what's been pleasing is that you've got inspectors who also have a very high level of emotional intelligence. A lot of these matters are very difficult to navigate. They involve very sensitive situations and or people experiencing very significant psychological issues. So we're seeing an increase in regulation and greater upskilling in regulators. And so I think that at this point in time, we're in a phase where regulators are willing to give employers a bit of room to move, a bit of tolerance and a grace period, in effect, to help them get up to speed. But I suspect that window of time is fast passing and will close shortly, and there'll be far less tolerance for employers who don't recognise these issues, don't risk assess properly, don't put in place controls, etc. I might throw to you, Dylan, to get your sort of reaction to that and also take us through the current state of play in a bit more detail regarding psychosocial health regulation in the UK.
Thanks, Dom. It's interesting what you've just sort of laid out there in terms of what's happening in Australia or in vast parts of Australia, because it does chime with what's happening in the UK. I think that they're quite similar approaches. I mean, I think one of the things which we didn't discuss at the outset of this discussion is that obviously the thing that the UK and Australia have in common is that there are criminal enforcement regimes for health and safety, whereas it's not quite the same in the US. And I wonder to what extent that governs the approach in these jurisdictions, that there's a lot more interference from the health and safety executive in the UK as there is in Australia, because there's an expectation of how workplaces are run with punitive sanctions for not getting it right. Ironically, when it's come to health, I think that the approach the HSE has taken is try to encourage employers to be more thoughtful about their workplaces and the employees that work for them, to sort of try and understand how they can create places for employees to go to work where they're happy to go to work. And therefore it's safer, they're more, engaged, they feel they have greater support, and it's a happier workplace. So it's a slightly different way of thinking than we've been used to in the past. Rather than a stick, it's more of a carrot at the moment. I think one of the things that's interesting to me is that what's been designed in the UK is this management standard. And the whole idea behind it has been to, I suppose, encourage good practice by employers, to, I suppose, simplify it, what's quite a nebulous concept at times and something which is intangible, and to heighten, as you said, emotional intelligence. And I think, here's where there are similarities between the UK and Australia, because when you look at this, there are sort of 6 risk areas identified in the management standard, and they seem to be very similar to what's going on in Australia. The 6 are demands, as you said, so identifying demands on employees and what particular demands they have in their role, and trying to work out how an employee can assist with that, or think about it, or alleviate it, or make demands fairer. And I suppose the second risk area goes hand in hand to that is, what controls are there? What control does the employer have over how he or she works, to try and sort of harmonize the demands with the controls aspects. Then the third and fourth risk areas are more sort of cultural. The third one looks at what support an employer is giving to employees, what there is in terms of encouragement or sponsorship or resources that are provided by the organization. And the fourth one is then relationships, looking at relationships at work, how people are managed, what interactions they have, to try and create more of a holistic place for people to go to work. And then the last 2 risk areas are more, I suppose, organizational and structural issues. The 5th one is around the person's role and how that fits within the organization. And then the last one, and perhaps the most significant one, is how an organization goes about change management. When you sort of stick those 6 together, you're looking at the demands and control of the individual's working habits. You're looking at the relationships and the support that an organization provides. And then you're also looking at organizationally, how the role fits into the broader organization and how the organization itself copes with change management. And if you think about how they've gone about it, they've tried to make it practical by having a simplified 6-based risk approach, so that, employers can actually do something with it and implement it in the workplace. I suppose where it's spun out from there, it's still in the early days, but they've brought out toolkits with questionnaires to try and identify questions employers can ask around these 6 risk areas. They've done case studies with a couple of organizations that have been through this change management to look at what worked and what didn't work. And I think the next stage is they're probably trying to develop, I suppose, sector-based management plans. Construction industry, each industry will have its own patterns and its own issues and its own challenges. So, if you think about where health and safety was 5 or 6 years ago, looking at how the management standard operates in the UK and how some of the things you mentioned are operating in Australia, it seems, we've come a long way, over the last 5 or 6 years in terms of the approach to employers being responsible employers and thinking holistically and very carefully about their employees' health. Now, I don't know how that feeds into the approach in the US, David, and whether, a very different course has been taken.
Thanks, Dylan. Yes, the U.S. will be the outlier again in this conversation as it relates to the regulatory approach. But I don't want to in saying that, miss a larger truth, which is that many employers in the U.S., particularly since the onset of COVID, are more focused on mental health and well-being, offering more robust employee assistance programs, free counseling sessions, more flexible leave, other benefits designed to help folks maintain better mental health. But I think that where the U.S. is different from Australia and the U.K. and others is that this is more of a voluntary effort, not one driven directly by regulators. One thing to note is that the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, has promulgated a standard, the ISO 45003, in 2021 to address psychosocial issues. But that is not yet enforced by U.S. regulators. Primary U.S. standard that could apply in this context is the General Duty Clause, which requires employers to maintain a safe working environment. The standard, though, focuses on protecting workers from death or serious physical harm. So it's not at all clear that it would apply to psychosocial harm. The closest that OSHA has really come to addressing psychosocial issues, other than just in fact sheets about mental health issues, is in its guidance regarding workplace violence. That guidance requires that employers protect workers from conditions that could lead to workplace violence and encourages employers to develop workplace violence programs, particularly in the healthcare space, and identify relevant risk factors. Those risk factors could include psychosocial factors, but there's no broader psychosocial standard at this point. So again, in the US, we're looking at more voluntary efforts rather than enforceable regulatory guidance at this point.
Thanks, David. And thank you too, Dylan. And there are a few points there that you raised that sort of resonate with me. I think that in terms of it's really interesting to hear about in the UK, the sort of carrot versus the stick approach. I think that here in Australia, it's very much traditionally safety regulation focuses on the stick. I think that as I said earlier, we're having sort of a grace period, but I feel like that's quickly coming to an end, and that the stick will be sort of brought out and applied in this area with similar vigour to other areas of safety enforcement. And I think here in Australia, the other point that is important to make in that context is, again, everywhere except Victoria, there is a statutory duty imposed on corporate officers to exercise due diligence to make sure that their organisations comply with the safety legislation, including these new psychosocial regulations. So there'll be focus from the regulators both at an organisational level, but also on the boardroom, and what it is that senior management teams and boards are doing to exercise due diligence in this space. So I see that as being a particular area of focus for regulators. The point that you raised about change management as well, Dylan, I think that's really interesting. We're seeing that as well. I think in the guidance material is referred to, not in a lot of detail, but we have seen, and I've been involved in a number of matters where trade unions have been raising psychosocial type risk factors and issues in the context of change management. And it's caused clients to really have to think carefully about that. And as a result of those instances, really make sure that that is well and truly figured into their change management plans going forward. So it's not just the consultation that you would expect in Australia with employees about the employment-related issues and the impact of change on people's jobs and those sorts of things, and potential redundancies and the like, but also the health aspects of it, which again is, for us is, I think, very new. And David, I think in terms of what you were saying, also really interesting, and it's really sort of pleasing to see that there is that sort of voluntary effort being undertaken by employers. And I think COVID, you mentioned that. I think COVID has really shone a greater light on this issue. I'm just speaking from an Australian perspective, but I think it really has brought into sharp focus the extent to which people in a workforce do need to, and individuals, everybody needs to grapple with some sort of psychosocial issue, be it a mild form of stress or something more serious. And certainly for a lot of people that became more pronounced through COVID. And now we have a situation where we certainly have a workforce which is far more disparate than it was pre-COVID. And so trying to assess the welfare of your workers becomes an even greater challenge in this sort of hybrid / more remote working environment. So thank you both for that. I think the way I would just sort of summarise just a couple of key takeaways for clients people who might be listening to this who are based outside of Australia, but their organisations have a physical presence in Australia. There are a couple of points that I would say, or I would emphasise, which is firstly, it's really important to be across the recent changes to the regulations that we've briefly discussed today and what needs to be done to ensure compliance. And that really needs to start by properly informed data-based assessment of the psychosocial risks arising from the organisation and the work that's performed and the steps that can be taken to mitigate those risks. So if you do fall into that category and this does have a direct impact on your organisation in terms of the Australian-based regulation, then that would be the key points that I would focus on. I suppose, Dylan, David, any particular points that you would want to draw out for clients listening to this who might not have a presence in Australia, but for whom you act, or certainly who operate in your parts of the world?
I think from my perspective, to go back to the management standard and to sort of start to look at your organisation and plan, from there, in the same way that you mentioned and David mentioned. I mean, there'll be zero tolerance for bullying and harassment and, sort of working in an unsafe working environment that would probably get straight enforcement action immediately if there were breaches of those expectations. But I think on the more nebulous concept of the sort of daily drudgery, if I can put it that way, of the grind of going to work and doing things over and over and repeating things over and over, the carrot, I think, has been to encourage employers to be more responsible employers and to care more about its workforce, A, because it's safer, and B, because it encourages greater productivity. And what I would say to clients listening to this is, what that's intended to encourage is to prevent lazy safety and prevent lazy health, and to make you look at the individual footprint and geographical reach of your organisation to see how you can manage that best within your company. So it is practical, and any sort of person listening to this wants assistance in how they go about it, and what can be quite a nebulous concept. And obviously, we're here to help. I think before I hand over to David, I mean, one thing that interests me, speaking to you, Dom, in Australia and David in the US, is to what extent, you guys are dealing not only with, I suppose, a federal issue, but also a sort of state-by-state issue, and whether, it's different in different parts of the country with different attitudes all over the place. I mean, at least in the UK, it's pretty centralized in terms of what the approach is, whereas in your jurisdictions, it might be multifaceted depending on which part of Australia or the US you're in.
From the Australian perspective, I think we've actually, over the past 10 years, embarked upon a process of harmonisation. So it means we're at a point now where actually, no matter which jurisdiction you're in, the requirements are very, very similar. So from a rules perspective, there's a lot of commonality. What is important to sort of understand, though, is it's still state and territory-based enforcement. And each regulator is different and has different approaches and different tools that it likes to use in terms of conducting investigations, and different attitudes towards certain issues that come up in investigations, whether it be to do with psychosocial health issues or physical health issues. So it's really important to understand that so that if you're in a position where you're dealing with a matter that's under investigation by a safety regulator, that you speak to someone who knows that regulator, knows how they operate, because differences can be quite significant. But I don't know how that compares to the situation in the US, David.
Yeah, in the US, the federal OSHA law sets a floor with regard to what the expectations are around the country. But then a large number of states have their own, what we call state plans, where they do their own enforcement to some degree within certain confines, and they set out certain standards, some of which may be higher than the federal floor. California, states like that often sort of lead the way in identifying new areas for enforcement. So that is something that U.S. employers particularly national employers, pay attention to, because there are variations in the way in which safety laws are enforced in the U.S. I think that ties in a little bit to sort of the way that U.S. employers need to think about, particularly U.S. employers that are thinking about expanding into other areas of the world who are already operating in other areas of the world, that they need to be aware that there may be variations, right? And they may be doing some great things in safety voluntarily, but there may be certain requirements in jurisdictions such as Australia and the UK, and they need to be aware of those and get some advice on those on the front end so that they avoid potentially unpleasant surprises on the back end.
Absolutely. And I think that the point that you made as well, Dylan, in terms of the focus being less on the stick and worrying about being prosecuted and like, which of course is something to be avoided. No employer wants to be in that position, but coming at it from a perspective of wanting to keep your people safe, healthy, and more productive is by far and away the best motivation for employers to be adopting when it comes to dealing with safety issues in this space. I'm fortunate to work for a number of clients where that very much is their mode of thinking. And you can see that the way that employees respond to that and always is a very positive response, and enables greater dialogue and greater buy-in from employees about the issues that they're trying to deal with, and the steps that the employer's trying to take, and trying to reach a spot where everyone's much more comfortable about what's being done in that space. So we might leave it there. Thank you both. It's been a real pleasure. I've certainly learned a lot, and thank you all for listening. By all means, feel free to reach out to David, Dylan, myself, or other members of our labour, employment and workplace safety team. If you'd like to discuss any of the issues that we've covered today, you can get our contact details from the K&L Gates website, www.klgates.com. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks again for listening to Working Wise. New episodes are available for download through iTunes, Google Play, and other podcast applications. If you have any topics you would like to hear about on the next Working Wise podcast, please send them to workingwise@klgates.com.